Hello and welcome to our podcast, EPG Talks. Today, we're delighted to kick off our first episode on the topic of climate governance. Why is it important and how do we do it well? My name is Luciana Miu and I'm head of clean economy at EPG, a Bucharest-based think tank specializing in energy and climate policy. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome to this episode Dr. Alina Averchenkova, Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment of the London School of Economics, and a visiting senior fellow at the Royal Elcano Institute. Dr. Averchenkova has extensive experience on climate change and international development, and her current work focuses on the analysis of climate change governance and legislation around the world, as well as capacity building and advisory services to governments, parliaments, and international organizations on these issues. She is a founding member of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies and a trustee of the Legal Response International Organization. Her past experience includes KPMG, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, First Climate, and NGO Environmental Defense Fund. And she holds a PhD in Economics and International Development from the University of Bath. Alina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you today, Luciana.
We're delighted to have you. So, getting right into the topic, when we talk about climate governance, which may be a topic that is not familiar to many of our listeners, what exactly do we mean when we say climate governance?
So the challenge of climate change is a very complex one. It cuts across different sectors of the economy, energy, agriculture. It also affects different parts of the population in different ways. So when we talk about climate governance, what we mean really is a system of institutions and processes for those institutions to interact with each other that can ensure that a country is able to actually effectively address this very complex issue. So a climate governance system would have mechanisms to determine the strategy, but also to make sure that the different actors of the society can work together to implement climate action.
Great. So there's a lot from what I'm hearing around collaboration, being able to work effectively together because climate change affects so many different sectors of the society, of the economy. And on that topic, do you think that at the moment, from what you've seen in your experience, that is something that is happening to a certain extent, that different departments, different institutions are working together? Do we still have work that needs to be done on collaborating for climate governance?
Well, I think this question will be answered. The answer would start with it depends, and depends what country we're talking about. Are we talking internationally, or are we talking at the national level in specific geographies? And I think different countries have different readiness to address climate action, and therefore some have very elaborate governance systems, while others still have quite a lot to do. And so maybe to answer that question, it would be useful to perhaps discuss a little bit more what are the key elements of the climate governance system that we would be looking for countries to establish. And there are a few. First of all, it's important that a country at the national level has a mechanism or has some way to set up the long-term objectives for climate action and the way to develop a strategy to get there. And to give you an example, many countries to do so adopt national climate change laws. And even at the regional level, the European Union has adopted the climate law, which sets that objective, the strategic objective, to reduce emissions of European Union to net zero by the year 2050. That's a long-term target. And then there is a mechanism to develop intermediate steps on how to get there. There are other elements that one needs to ensure, which is once you have that long-term target, to set then a shorter-term targets and intermediate steps on how to get there. And different countries, again, do it in different ways. For example, United Kingdom has a system of so-called carbon budgets, which means every 5 years in the parliament, there is a debate on what a climate target for the next 5-year period should be. And those targets are set 12 years in advance so that the government and businesses actually have time to prepare for the climate targets they will have to meet. And the way the target is set is that there is an independent expert advisory group, so a group of independent scientists, economists, sociologists who work independently financially and administratively from the government to provide advice on what a target should be. They propose a target for consideration by the government. In the UK, that body is called Climate Change Committee. And then the government either takes their advice or they might modify it, and then they bring it to Parliament. And Parliament has a final say in determining the carbon budget for the 5-year period. And the idea is that you need to make sure that those 5-year steps actually add up and lead you to reaching net zero emissions by the year 2050 in the case of the UK. So that's one example. So I'd say if we look at the UK, the climate governance system is pretty comprehensive. There are systems similar to that in France, in Germany. They would all each have their own weaknesses and strengths. I think one challenge that all of the countries face, which is shared, is possibly coordination, how to make sure that different government departments, but also different actors across society, the regional governments, the municipal governments actually work together towards the shared objective.
That's great. So there's a couple of key criteria here, the long-term objective and the strategy for how to get there, which is usually operationalized through a climate change law, intermediate steps that add up that all take us to achieving that long-term objective, and that independent scientific advice, which is quite important to really ground the strategy in science, really. One question that I had based on the challenge that you just raised there, which is coordination. Do you have any examples of how some of these countries have maybe done this? You talked about, for example, municipalities and local authorities needing to be better coordinated. Does the UK do anything on this? And if so, what do they do to try and bring these actors together and coordinate them for climate change mitigation?
So there are different ways that, again, different countries address that. One way is, for example, in the climate change law, once the national target is established, the law could mandate regional governments or local governments to integrate those climate objectives into their respective strategies, and to make sure that whatever strategy is developed at the regional or local level is in accordance with the objectives set for the whole country, for the climate law, for example, or some countries do it through national strategy. In some countries, the local authorities and municipalities are actually included in the coordination mechanisms on climate change established nationally. For example, Mexico, just to go outside of Europe, has established a national coordinating body on climate change. And that body includes several representatives of the Association of the Local Governments and Regional Governments to sit on it. So that's another one. Another way that national government can actually guide local and national and regional action, and that to some extent happens in the UK as well, is through investments. So obviously municipalities get quite a size, depending on which country, but in general, they get some budget from the federal level or from the national level. And so if those budget allocations explicitly take into account climate objectives and actually earmark some expenses, some finance for investment in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions or in adaptation to the impacts of climate change, that also ensures that local action and regional action is aligned with national ones. But it's not an easy task, but I think there are ways that countries are trying to improve coordination, we call it vertical coordination from bottom up, from the local to regional to national, and top down as well.
That's great. So we're hearing a lot about the different challenges of good climate governance and also about how some countries have managed to overcome these challenges. Maybe it's time to take a bit of a step back and to ask the question, why is good climate governance so important? So the examples that you've mentioned when it comes to Europe have been the UK, France, Germany. These all tend to be Western countries. And coming from somewhere like Romania, where perhaps the debate around climate change is still a little bit younger than in Western Europe, why would good climate governance be important for countries like Romania, but also looking at maybe other emerging economies around the world? Why do we need to focus on this?
No, that's a great question, and it's a very fair one to ask. And I think, well, let's start from the global why. I think at the global level, it is very clear that if we want to avoid dangerous climate change, the planet needs to decarbonize as soon as possible. And that means we also need to address emissions in emerging economies and economies in transition, as they used to be called. Because these economies, while they might not be emitting the greater share of emissions at the moment, over time, this is where the growth of emissions would happen if they develop on the pathway, which we call as a high carbon. So if they invest as they develop into industries which emit a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's also very important because these countries actually have a choice still, because they are on the growth pathways. They can choose whether to invest in developing infrastructure that is heavily based on, say, coal energy or energy based on gas, or whether they shift straight away to renewable energy. This is actually more challenging once you've locked your infrastructure in. So once you've already built power stations, they will be in operation for over 30 years. So once you're still expanding, for example, your energy capacity, it makes sense to do it straight away in a low carbon way. Now, why? So that's on the mitigation side. On adaptation side, it's very important to think about having a system of institutions that actually help emerging economies adapt to the impacts of climate change, make infrastructure climate proof so that you don't build a road in the area which will be flooded in a few years due to the sea level rise, that you think about developing agriculture in a way that takes into account new climate patterns and the droughts and availability of water, which will be changing, and new temperature pattern and so on. And so where does climate governance come into that? Well, I think what we started from that, having a system of institutions, processes, and the rules that set interactions among those institutions, but also having the right policy incentives that would direct investments into low carbon and climate resilient options. Climate governance is essential for that. You need to establish that system of institutions. And unless you have that, it's actually very difficult to get to grapple on this issue.
That's a very good point, with the clarity that investors need to have to move forward to low carbon pathways. I think that's something that we see a lot of conversation within EPG and within our stakeholder groups in Romania about the lack of positioning, of firm positioning of some authorities on these aspects, which leads to a lack of clarity from investors in terms of, will my investment be worthwhile, or am I just going to be tied up in bottlenecks because there's no commitments, no legislated commitments to climate change objectives. I wanted to flip this question a little bit as well. So we see the role of good climate governance in directing investment and holding institutional actors accountable. What might direct good climate governance? In the countries that you mentioned, there's also a larger public awareness of climate change, is there not? Having lived in the UK, I know that we were experiencing quite a lot of protests against, slow action on climate change. What is the role of the public in pushing countries to adopt good climate governance and holding them to setting up independent advisory bodies and implementing a national climate law? If we could just dissect that a little bit to understand where the push for good climate governance could come from.
Great question, Luciana. I think the general public and the pressure from the public is an essential element of. Actually, it's a key precondition for the world to be able to actually effectively address the challenge of climate change and to come out of the climate crisis that we're facing. And I think there are two sides to this question. I think, firstly, absolutely, the pressure from public plays a key role. I think leading up to the Paris Agreement, I have been part of climate negotiations in different roles since the year 2000, actually, so for over 20 years now. And what I can see is that one of the big reasons why Paris Agreement actually came into force was this growing pressure from public but also from progressive private sector companies to actually turn this around, turn the pace in the climate action. So Fridays for the Future, the protests, for example, played a key role. And I think in many countries we're seeing, and particularly in democracies where the government depends on the votes of the general public directly, we have seen that play an important role. And I'd give you an example in the UK. Kind of leading up, UK was the first country to adopt a comprehensive climate law in 2008, so quite a long time ago. But why was it possible? Well, partially because, or to a large extent, leading up to the adoption of Climate Change Act of 2006, 2007, leading up to the general elections, the Conservative Party understood that the young voters actually are placing increasingly high importance to environmental issues and to the issue of climate change. And so I have a picture which was actually, well, reported in the newspapers. David Cameron at the time campaigning for the Conservative Party is hugging a husky and says, vote blue, go green. So that was their slogan. And so effectively, when they became part of the government, they were much more well, and the general leading up to the debate of Climate Change Act, there was broad political consensus on the importance of doing something about climate. So I think there is direct role for that, for the general public. On the other hand, I should also emphasize that we can't just sit down, draft a perfect climate law or perfect climate policy, pass it somehow among politicians or in the government in a small expert circle, and expect that we've done a good job and now the country will turn around and somehow become low carbon and climate resilient. What we're seeing when this is done in this way, you get backlash from citizens, because addressing climate change actually requires quite significant changes in everyone's lives. It requires switching your energy supplier from the one that's based on coal to the one that offers renewable-based generation. It requires thinking about, do I actually need to consume as much as I do, or do I want to switch maybe to eating less meat and more vegetables, can I recycle a bit more? So there are a lot of choices. And unless, or I switch to electric car instead of driving a highly emitted diesel engine, for example. And unless there is a good understanding among citizens, unless there is a public debate where it's actually clear what the country is doing, why it's doing that, and how it's doing that, we can't expect that the public will just follow. And that's why I think, firstly, climate law is important, because in democracies, again, the process of developing and debating a climate law is a very public one. There is a debate involved, different political parties, NGOs, businesses, but also citizens can participate in that. And secondly, I think there needs to be a direct mechanism for actually engaging public. And that's another element of climate governance system, which we haven't really addressed yet. There needs to be a mechanism to actually engage public and encourage public participation in climate policy. And one very exciting way of doing that, which is emerging now and being applied all across Europe, is, for example, citizens' assemblies on climate change.
That's a great topic to dive into a little bit, because we've talked about the sort of benefits of climate laws and good climate governance for the climate and for setting countries on low carbon pathways. But public participation, not just for climate change, but for societal issues in general, is something really crucial to build and keep that trust in institutions and to get everybody working together. Let's dive in a little bit into these citizens' assemblies. Can you give us some examples of climate change citizens' assemblies around Europe or worldwide? What kind of impact have they had? And do we see any benefits from them, or is it too early to tell? On that topic, I'd be quite interested to hear your thoughts.
No, absolutely, Luciana. So maybe first it's worth to explain a little bit what do we mean by climate assembly, because climate assembly is different. Some countries talk about public participation, and what they mean by that is posting a policy document on internet and letting public comment on it. And that's, of course, an important way to inform people, but that's not really a way to offer meaningful public participation. So citizens' assemblies are based on what we call deliberative democracy methods, which is you draw citizens through democratic lottery. So it's basically the invitation is sent to randomly selected set of people. And the idea is that they should represent the average makeup of the country in terms of the levels of income, gender balance, different levels of education, regional balance, racial profile. In some countries, although this is still an emerging area, some countries take into account also balanced distribution of political views on climate change. So you don't want just to get people who vote green or those who vote more on the left side, kind of with more socialist oriented parties. You want to have a good balance. So Scotland, for example, has included that directly as one of their criteria for selecting people. So a larger group gets an invitation, and then from that larger group, a quota sampling is run according to those criteria that I mentioned. And you get, again, it depends on different countries, but usually 100, 150 people who then come together to learn about the issue of climate change and to deliberate on the question which is set forward for them. And we have quite a lot of examples recently. As part of the knowledge network on climate assemblies, we have actually studied all of the experience in Europe at the national level recently. So you had Ireland, one of the first countries which had that on the back of the assembly which tackled issues of abortion. They then held one on climate change. France, this was one of the best covered in the media, attracted a lot of attention. President Macron actually came in the middle of the assembly and met with the participants. And that one actually had quite a lot of recommendations being followed through. For example, implementation of the partial ban on domestic flights where there is good train connection in France. That was a recommendation which came out of the Citizens' Assembly. A lot of recommendations that came out of the French Assembly were actually reflected in the national climate change law, which was adopted soon after. In Ireland, the Assembly led to creation of a new institution, a new select committee on climate change in the parliament. There were also recently assemblies in Austria, in Spain. That one was mandated through the climate law. It just completed last summer. There are also examples in Eastern Europe. Very recently, there was an assembly on energy parity in Poland, which was very interesting and is having, as the initial report show, it's having quite a lot of resonance in some quarters in Poland. There have been assemblies at the regional level, for example, in Estonia. There has been an assembly again on energy security and energy transition, involving targeting specifically young people, because traditionally it was difficult to engage them, that particular group, in the decision making. So the assembly specifically tackled that group. There have been also an assembly in the UK, at the UK level, in Scotland. So these are just some of the examples. And I think we are already, well, we are assessing impacts as we go, but what we can say is there are 4 different types of impacts. So some of them lead to creation of new institutions, like the case of Ireland that I've mentioned. Some of them, and actually all of them, lead to increased public debate on climate change. And particularly in France, there has been a fierce discussion on climate change while the assembly was going. It was a big media point. All of the major newspapers wrote about it. It was on TV. So it can actually galvanize and engage a broader public than the 150 or so people who are part of the assembly. It can impact climate legislation, climate policies. I gave you the French example. And finally, and I think for me, this is one of the really exciting and really promising points. It seems to completely transform the opinion and kind of the way of life of many of the participants of the assemblies. And I'm saying that based on their own testimonies. What we hear from people who have gone for climate assembly is that given this opportunity to learn, because the members of the assembly hear from experts from different fields, coming from different sectors, on the climate issue and also the opportunities to address climate change. And so they would actually say that, having known now that we know, we actually take steps to change the way that we live our own lives. But many of them also become activists in their own communities. They go to their school boards, to the libraries, and create talks, to their kind of local associations. They lobby and push their local and regional governments. So it becomes quite a powerful force, actually, to mobilize citizens, which I think is really exciting and really important as we tackle climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very promising as a mechanism for meaningful public participation, because I do feel, like you mentioned, when we talk about public participation, there's public participation and then there's meaningful public participation, right? More than just a piece of legislation being put on a website and half-heartedly communicated to the public for expressing their views on something that might even be too technical for them to fully understand. So as a way of meaningful public engagement, citizens' assemblies sound very, very promising. One thing that I wanted to touch on here is what happens after a climate assembly. So you mentioned there are a couple of ways that it could impact future legislation. From my experience with trying to engage certain stakeholders groups, it's very important that they understand what is happening with their input. They're dedicating their time and their resources to participating in these assemblies. What do you think, how important is it for the participants to know what is going to happen with the recommendations, with the input that they provide, as a way of sort of building that trust and that credibility? Because as a government, if you organize an assembly and you get a group of people together and you promise them that something is going to happen with the recommendations and it doesn't, do you think then that makes it more difficult for the public to trust this institution in the future?
Well, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. I think this, from our analysis in KNOCA, this has been one of the most challenging points and the weaknesses around climate assemblies, that oftentimes there isn't a good plan up front in terms of what will happen with the recommendations. And sometimes, well, we have different examples. Sometimes over-promising is not good, because I think it's important to say that climate assemblies are a consultative mechanism. It's not a decision-making mechanism. So they can suggest to government and to parliament what citizens feel should be done. But that doesn't mean that all of the recommendations can be taken on board and implemented. And that's why you have representative democratic institutions. We have parliament, we have civil servants. And so, and an example I wanted to give here is President Macron at the beginning of the French Assembly made a rather bold promise that all of the recommendations will be taken on board, or at least that was the way that the participants interpreted it, and also some of the stakeholders and the media. And of course, when later on it was clear that not everything can be taken on board, and what he really meant was they will be considered, and then the government will decide which ones to take into account, that created the feeling of kind of disappointment and might affect the credibility of the assembly, if you think about that. On the other extreme, you could think, in Germany, the Citizens' Assembly was actually organized by NGOs. It was not commissioned by the government, as in some other countries. It was not commissioned by parliament. Civil society organized it with the hope that once the recommendations come out, the policymakers and parliament would pay attention to it. And that, of course, may happen, but it may also not happen. So there is a certain risk in terms of ensuring that there is actually proper follow-up. So what our recommendation is from KNOCA, based on the variety of experience we have looked at, is that it's absolutely vital to think through, before you call for climate assembly, before one is held, what is the pathway? Who is going to consider the recommendations? How they're going to do that? And then to make sure that those actors that you're targeting actually are engaged up front. They are engaged in thinking through what are the useful questions for the assembly to tackle. You don't want the assembly tackling the question on something where a decision has already been taken. It needs to be, again, talking about meaningful participation. It needs to be something, an issue where there is a political dilemma, where there might be some divisive views, or where the government is not quite sure how far and how fast, how ambitious it could go, that's where citizens' assembly is absolutely viable. So I'd say that is something definitely that needs to be improved. Kind of the follow-up in terms of the official pathway for the recommendations. And then I just wanted to very shortly comment on the other points you made in terms of engaging stakeholders, and particularly civil society. I think that's another kind of underused opportunity at the moment. What we have observed with a lot of climate assemblies to date is that climate civil society, climate NGOs, have not really engaged to the extent they could with climate assemblies. Sometimes they don't have resources. Sometimes in some countries there isn't really great understanding of what the assembly would deliver. And so I've interviewed some civil society actors who would say, well, this can actually delay climate action. Why do we even need public engagement? Let's just get on with it and push for that. Well, for the reasons I've mentioned earlier, it is vital that we don't just get on with it, but we bring the public with us. And what we've been now collaborating with NGOs and delivering the point that actually citizens' assemblies and citizens are the best allies that NGOs could actually have for pushing for ambitious climate action. And what better way there is to lobby a politician than to say, look, the citizens' assembly that represents the average makeup of the country, the average makeup of your voters, this is what they have recommended. And I think this is what you should do. So there is definitely much more than that civil society can do, and even private sector, to capitalize on the outcomes on citizens' assemblies.
Very, very interesting. And again, speaks to the real potential of meaningful public engagement. And I have been part of conversations and debates around the timing, the time that's required for meaningful public engagement and the urgency of acting on climate change. But as you say, it's important for everybody to go along together, otherwise it won't be sustainable. I wanted to take a bit of a step back from the public engagement piece that we've been talking about and go back a little bit towards climate laws, framework climate laws. And you've mentioned the three sort of key elements of it: the long-term objective and the strategy to get there, the intermediate steps, and independent advisory body. And you've given the UK as an example. Do we have any other examples of member states that have implemented climate laws? And in particular, I'm interested of some of the challenges around implementing these climate laws, and what might be the makers of success for climate law becoming a reality. Is there a certain political consensus that is needed before we can start thinking about a climate law? Are there certain institutions that need to be made responsible before we can draft a climate law? Or is it something that we should start working on now as Romania? But let's start with a little bit more about the experience around EU member states with national climate laws.
So thank you for this question. I think actually globally at the moment we count about 50 countries which have some form of kind of what we call framework climate change law, a law that provides an overarching guidance for the whole economy and of climate action. And a lot of these countries are in the EU. So I can just mention, obviously, in addition to the regional climate law in the EU, we have Denmark having, for example, climate law, which already contains a net zero target, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Iceland, Luxembourg, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, well, Switzerland, not part of the EU, but close ally, and the United Kingdom as well. So these are just some of the countries that have overarching framework climate laws in the EU and have already legislated net zero targets. There are other countries which haven't yet integrated net zero targets, but I focused here on those which have. So this kind of gives you a good spread. So there are some countries from Northern Europe, but we also have Italy and Spain in the south. In Eastern Europe, Hungary has legislated kind of net zero target. Latvia is working on their climate change law at the moment. Estonia, I think, is in the earlier stages, but the work is also happening there. So you have really a range of examples. In terms of how climate laws come about and what needs to be in place, we actually have a project we're working on at the moment to understand precisely that question, but we're focusing a bit more specifically on net zero commitment. So how does it come about, and then how does it get then legislated? And what we are seeing is that roughly, well, there are different factors that play into the ability of country to adopt climate change law. Some countries are driven very much by peer pressure, kind of internationally being a leader in implementing Paris Agreement. I give you an example outside of Europe. Fiji, small island, highly vulnerable, emerging, developing state. They actually adopted climate law and legislated net zero target. You would think for them adaptation is the first priority, and it is. Nevertheless, they are tackling mitigation as well. And for them, one of the decisive factors was that leadership at the international level and implementing Paris Agreement. What we're hearing in Europe, for example, looking at the case of Spain at the moment, European level law, the net zero target at the EU level, and the whole kind of infrastructure of different policies that countries need to implement has been one of the critical factors actually for Spain to go for climate law. Other factors that play into the decision to actually adopt ambitious climate policy and climate legislation is kind of the economic advantage and access to finance. So countries which, again, for Spain, that's also a consideration. They want to be a leader in renewable energy generation. They might want to become a net exporter of renewable energy within Europe. Having climate law that sets them on that path actually helps them economically, as well as kind of in terms of the political leadership and so on. Another factor, and I think we haven't talked about it yet, one benefit of climate laws that we find, and we found it very strongly through the study we did in the UK, looking at the impact of the UK climate law, is the ability of climate legislation to insulate, to protect your climate objectives against political change. For example, in the UK, you've seen 5 or 6 changes of government since the climate law has been adopted with different level of commitment to climate issue. Yet the country has to implement its targets because they are set in law. So the incoming government, regardless of the result of the election, can't just turn the switch off and say we are abolishing it and we're doing something else. So I think there is a range of factors which for different countries, different factors play a bigger or smaller role. But in general, I'd say there needs to be a champion, political champion. And sometimes that political champion can be a president. I give you an example of an emerging economy, Mexico. In 2012, Mexico was the first emerging economy and the first oil-producing country to adopt climate change legislation at the national level. And it was actually initiated very much by President then Calderon, whose term was coming to an end, and he wanted to leave political legacy. And that legacy, one of the central pieces was that Mexico would become a leader among the leaders in climate change. And so he pushed very much for that, supported then by environmental NGOs and progressive business players. In other countries, for example, again, the UK at the time of climate change law adoption, UK was playing a prominent role as the president of G7. They were also very much kind of looking to strengthen the international image as a broker on issues of international importance. So climate action was actually an issue that they wanted to push strongly on. So I've given you a variety of examples, and so I suppose for Romania, the question would be, what are the key benefits that the country would see, and also who are the political champions currently that could actually push for climate law, and then could help prepare, say, members of parliament, because there needs to be some capacity building, awareness raising, there needs to be debates. It doesn't just happen overnight, and in some countries it takes years to actually get to the adoption of the law. So yeah, the political champions and the narrative. What are the key benefits for Romania that are specific to Romania? And start from there, I suppose.
No, absolutely. I think that's really what we're going to be trying to do in this project, is to identify who those champions can be, how to build that consensus and that narrative. Because I know in many economies in transition where, you know, we're just starting to develop, especially in emerging economies, especially in low-income countries, the idea of then having to quote unquote make that sacrifice as a citizen. You mentioned earlier on needing to change the lifestyle, needing to rethink how you live your life to be able to contribute to climate change mitigation. That can often be seen as a burden. And if we want the public to come along with this commitment to climate change, we really need to be evidencing the opportunities as well. So how climate change mitigation can contribute to revitalizing local economies and research and development getting off the ground, and new value chains, new business opportunities, new jobs, which is something that in the Romanian context speaks quite a lot, especially to the population in rural areas. So these are all things that as part of our project on climate governance we'll be attempting to tackle, but it's really important to hear that these are some key drivers that we need to acknowledge before sort of moving towards how do we set up a climate change law in Romania. I would, I think, move towards wrapping up the discussion, unless you feel like there's any points that you wanted to raise, anything that we have maybe missed out on that we should address a little bit. Otherwise, I would move to the points that you would leave with Romanian policymakers.
So perhaps two points that we haven't touched upon yet very quickly, which are the other kind of key governance functions and key elements that the climate law could address. And one is finance mobilization. I think we talked about orienting private sector investment, but there is also public investment, which is very important to be able to address climate change. And so what we're seeing is that having a climate law in place and also coordination mechanisms that come with it actually allows countries to align their budgets to the challenge of climate change much better. So countries are implementing, for example, tagging expenditures on climate change, or they may require actually every ministry to specifically outline what expenditures and investments they envision on climate change in their annual budget submissions. I think Spain does that, and also some Scandinavian countries. And finally, the key element, which I think one of the key reasons as well to have a climate law, is that it actually strengthens accountability and transparency for climate action. And one example is in the UK, climate law requires the government to come to the parliament every year. Every year, the minister responsible for climate change has to face the parliament and report on progress with implementation of climate action, with implementation of carbon emission reduction targets. And so that creates an information point when media writes about it, the stakeholders engage on it, and it actually keeps the government on their toes. They can't just make promises and then do nothing about them. So that's what actually laws can do, improve accountability. And they give different actors a possibility to litigate, to bring the government to court, or to bring private sector that is not meeting their commitments to court as well. And we're seeing that all around. So I think that these are the couple of things I wanted to mention that we haven't talked about. In terms of the key points to leave policymakers with, perhaps in terms of the key kind of benefits of framework climate laws, I think as we discussed, a good climate law allows you to do four things, many other things, but the four key things. First of all, it allows to protect climate policy and climate objectives against political turmoil and political cycles when new government comes in. Secondly, it sets direction of travel and guides investment decisions, both in the private sector, but also in the public sector, as we discussed. It strengthens the transparency and accountability for implementation of climate action, creates reporting mechanisms, creates mechanisms for revising objectives where more ambitious action is required. And finally, deliberation of the law and of progress with its implementation brings together key political actors and the public, brings them on the same page in respect to climate action, and aligns key stakeholders around the shared objective for climate action, which is absolutely essential for our ability to address climate crisis.
That is wonderful. So the 4 key points for Romanian policymakers considering or interested in adopting a national framework climate law: resilience that it provides to political colors and cycles, the direction that it sets and the accountability for holding to that direction, as well as the opportunity that it gives for actors to coordinate in a sector which may be somewhat fragmented from the point of view of who's responsible and who's actually talking about it. Alina, thank you so very much for this very engaging discussion. To our listeners, I really hope that this discussion has increased your appetite to learn a little bit more about climate governance, answered some of your questions, and maybe set you on a direction for your further learning and growth when it comes to climate policy. This episode is available on EPG's YouTube and Spotify channels, as well as on our website. And we look forward to having you back again soon, dear listeners, for another episode of EPG Talks.